Inside America's most isolated women's prison, how female inmates are transported to Louisiana. Full documentary. No one sees the moment when freedom officially ends. Not the courtroom. Not the sentence. Not even the cell door. It ends somewhere quieter, inside a moving vehicle, hands restrained, eyes forward, surrounded by strangers who will not speak your name. 4 women entering Louisiana's only state-run female correctional facility. The journey itself is the first punishment, and it changes them long before the gates appear. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This documentary examines how women are psychologically and procedurally moved through the American correctional system, focusing on the transfer process into Louisiana's sole women's prison. What you are about to hear is not dramatization. It is based on documented correctional procedures, peer-reviewed psychological research, and verified institutional data from the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, the American Psychological Association, APA, Craig Haney's Prison Psychology Research, John Irwin's Sociological Prison Studies, State and Federal Correctional Intake Standards, empirical findings from the Chicago Crime Lab. This film does not ask for sympathy. It asks for understanding. Because before incarceration becomes routine, it begins as shock. The transfer. The transfer rarely begins with warning. Women are often notified hours, sometimes minutes, before movement. No countdown. No preparation. No closure. Psychologically, this moment triggers what researchers describe as acute loss of agency, a sudden realization that personal decision-making has ended. According to APA research on incarceration stress responses, this stage is marked by heightened cortisol levels, dissociation, and emotional numbing. For many women, the transfer begins in county jail. They are searched, cataloged, re-identified by number instead of name. Correctional transport protocols prioritize uniformity over comfort. Shackles are standardized. Movement is synchronized. Conversation is discouraged. This is intentional. The National Institute of Justice has documented that early transport procedures are designed to establish institutional authority immediately, reducing resistance later during intake. But authority has psychological consequences. Women entering long-term confinement experience what Craig Haney describes as institutional shock, a mental state where uncertainty becomes more distressing than punishment itself. No one tells them how long the ride will be. Some transfers last hours. Others last an entire day. Bathroom access is controlled. Food is functional, not sufficient. Silence is enforced, not requested. A former Louisiana inmate, documented through post-release correctional interviews, described the transport as the moment I stopped being a person and started being property. This language is not accidental. John Irwin's prison sociology research explains that early depersonalization is one of the strongest predictors of institutional compliance. Once identity fractures, survival replaces resistance. By the time the vehicle reaches its destination, many women have already begun adjusting their behavior, limiting eye contact, minimizing speech, emotionally withdrawing. Not because they are told to, because they are learning. And this is only the beginning. Intake. Arrival is not dramatic. There is no announcement, no sense of place. Only movement, forward, inward, permanent. The first instruction is silence. Intake begins with compliance, not explanation. According to NIJ Intake Procedure Analysis, this phase is designed to strip unpredictability from human behavior by enforcing immediate routine adherence. Women are processed in sequence. Property is removed. Clothing is exchanged. Bodies are examined for contraband, injuries, and identifiers. Psychologically, this moment marks the transition from temporary custody to institutional identity. The APA identifies intake as one of the highest risk phases for emotional destabilization, particularly for women with prior trauma histories, which, according to national correctional data, make up a significant portion of the female prison population. The questions come quickly. Medical history, mental health screening, substance use, suicidal ideation. They are not conversational. They are diagnostic. Chicago Crime Lab research on early incarceration shows that women often respond with emotional flattening, minimizing symptoms, suppressing distress, not because they are stable, but because vulnerability feels dangerous in unfamiliar power structures. This is survival behavior. Photographs are taken. The camera does not ask permission. Craig Haney's research describes this as identity compression, the reduction of a complex individual into a fixed institutional record. Once captured, that image follows an inmate throughout classification, housing, and disciplinary review. Next comes orientation, brief, procedural, overwhelming. Rules are stated without context. Consequences are listed without examples. Rights are mentioned but not explained. John Owen referred to this phase as learning power through confusion. When information exceeds comprehension, authority becomes absolute by default. Some women cry quietly. Some stare ahead. Some say nothing at all. Silence, in this environment, is often misinterpreted as strength. But psychologically, it signals emotional containment, a temporary shutdown that allows the mind to function under extreme stress. The APA warns that prolonged containment can later manifest as anxiety, depression, or explosive behavior. Before housing assignment, classification begins. Security level, medical needs, behavioral risk. Decisions are made quickly, based on limited data. And once assigned, movement resumes. There is no pause to process what has been lost, only the pressure to adapt to what comes next. Because in prison, adjustment is not gradual. It is immediate. Classification. Classification is where uncertainty becomes structure. After intake, women are no longer moved as a group. They are evaluated individually, but never personally. Files replace faces. Correctional staff assess security level, housing placement, and supervision intensity using risk assessment tools designed to predict behavior under confinement. According to the National Institute of Justice, these instruments prioritize prior convictions, institutional history, and perceived compliance risk. What they cannot measure is psychological context. Craig Haney's work highlights a critical gap. Classification systems evaluate behavior without accounting for trauma-driven survival responses, especially common among incarcerated women. Withdrawal may be read as stability. Hypervigilance may be read as defiance. This misinterpretation shapes outcomes. Women labeled low risk are often placed in environments with minimal support. Those labeled high risk experience heightened surveillance and reduced autonomy. Both placements carry consequences. The American Psychological Association notes that early classification strongly influences long-term mental health trajectories inside prison. Initial housing conditions can either stabilize stress responses or intensify them. For many women entering Louisiana's facility, classification occurs after only a few hours of observation. Not days. Not weeks. Hours. A formerly incarcerated woman interviewed in post-release correctional studies described the moment this way. They decided who I was before I knew how to act. This perception aligns with John Irwin's sociological findings. He observed that once an institutional identity is assigned, inmates often conform to it, not by choice, but by pressure. Behavior adapts to expectation. In dorm-style housing, women learn social rules quickly: who speaks, who watches, who remains invisible. In cell-based units, isolation accelerates internalization, reducing emotional expression to avoid attention. Chicago Crime Lab research shows that within the first week of placement, many inmates alter sleep patterns, posture, and speech cadence, unconscious adjustments that signal submission and reduce conflict. This is not weakness. It is cognitive adaptation. Classification ends with a final directive. Escorted through corridors, past locked doors, women enter spaces they did not choose, with people they do not know, under rules they do not yet understand. And once the door closes, a new phase begins. Not confinement. Conditioning. Conditioning. Conditioning does not announce itself. It settles in quietly, through repetition. Lights on. Movement. Meals. Silence. Count again. According to Craig Haney's longitudinal prison studies, the human mind adapts to confinement by recalibrating what feels normal. Over time, routines stop feeling imposed and start feeling necessary. This is psychological conditioning. Women learn quickly that predictability is safety. Deviation draws attention. Attention invites consequence. The American Psychological Association identifies this phase as the point where self-regulation begins to replace external control, not because rules are accepted, but because resistance becomes exhausting. Behavior changes first. Speech softens. Movements become economical. Emotions are rationed. These are not orders. They are observations. John Owen described this process as prisonization, the internalization of institutional norms that reshape identity. For women, prisonization often manifests as relational caution, emotional withdrawal, and heightened sensitivity to perceived threats. This is intensified by the environment itself. Dormitory living amplifies surveillance, not only from staff, but from other inmates. Privacy disappears. Sleep becomes fragmented. Trust is calculated. The Chicago Crime Lab has documented that environments with constant observation accelerate hypervigilance, a trauma-linked state where the brain remains alert even during rest. Over time, this vigilance becomes default. A woman incarcerated in Louisiana described the shift in a post-release interview. "I stopped thinking about who I was before. I started thinking about who I needed to be today." That transition marks the psychological midpoint of incarceration. Not acceptance. Adaptation. But adaptation has a cost. APA research links prolonged conditioning to emotional flattening, reduced impulse control, and difficulty making independent decisions, effects that persist even after release. Inside prison, these changes are rewarded. Compliance is praised. Stillness is interpreted as maturity. Silence becomes safety. But beneath that surface, tension accumulates. Because conditioning does not erase emotion. It compresses it. And compressed emotion does not disappear. It waits. Pressure. Pressure is not constant. It builds. In women's prisons, conflict rarely announces itself through violence. It appears in subtler forms: social fracture, emotional overload, and psychological fatigue. According to NIJ behavioral environment studies, prolonged confinement in highly regulated spaces increases stress accumulation, especially where autonomy is limited and personal boundaries are blurred. For women, this pressure is often relational. Shared spaces mean shared tension. Small misunderstandings echo. Silence becomes interpretation. Craig Haney's research emphasizes that emotional suppression under coercive environments does not reduce conflict, it delays it. When expression is restricted, distress seeks alternative outlets. Behavior shifts. Irritability rises. Sleep becomes unstable. Minor rule violations increase. Not as rebellion, as release. The American Psychological Association links these behaviors to emotional overload, a condition where the brain's coping systems are saturated. In this state, reactions become faster, not stronger, sharp responses to small triggers. Staff observe this pattern closely. Correctional policy interprets rising infractions as discipline issues. Psychology recognizes them as stress indicators. The distinction matters. John Owen noted that institutions often respond to pressure with greater control, unintentionally intensifying the very conditions that produce it. Restricted movement increases frustration. Reduced social access deepens isolation. Heightened surveillance amplifies anxiety. The Chicago Crime Lab found that in closed environments, pressure follows a predictable curve: initial compliance, emotional compression, behavioral leakage. A formerly incarcerated woman described the moment pressure peaked. It wasn't anger. It was feeling full. Like there was nowhere left to put anything. This fullness is dangerous. Not because it leads to violence, but because it erodes judgment. Women under sustained pressure may withdraw completely, self-isolate, or emotionally detach. Others may seek control through routine dominance, rigid behavior, or social alignment. None of these are conscious strategies. They are coping mechanisms. And every coping mechanism has limits. When pressure reaches its threshold, the system responds. Sometimes with discipline. Sometimes with intervention. Sometimes with nothing at all. And the outcome of that response shapes what happens next. Control. When pressure reaches its limit, control becomes visible. Not dramatic. Not loud. Procedural. Control in a women's prison is rarely about force. According to NIJ correctional management studies, it is about anticipation, preventing escalation by tightening structure before instability becomes obvious. Movement is reduced. Schedules narrow. Privileges become conditional. For the institution, this is management. For the inmate, it is contraction. Craig Haney's research explains that when autonomy is repeatedly restricted after periods of adjustment, the brain interprets it as learned powerlessness, a state where effort feels meaningless because outcomes appear predetermined. Behavior changes again. Some women become hypercompliant. Others disengage completely. A few resist in small, calculated ways. None of these responses are random. The American Psychological Association identifies this phase as a critical point where self-concept erodes. Decision-making weakens. Initiative fades. Emotional responses flatten further, not from calm, but from fatigue. John Owen described control escalation as the moment inmates stop asking, "What happens if I try?" and start asking, "What happens if I don't?" That question shapes everything. The Chicago Crime Lab observed that under intensified control, women often reduce communication. Fewer requests, fewer complaints, fewer explanations. Silence becomes strategy, not fear. A woman interviewed after release recalled, "I learned how to disappear without leaving." This disappearance is psychological. Presence without participation. Compliance without engagement. Survival without identity. From the institution's perspective, control appears effective. Incidents decrease. Noise lowers. Order stabilizes. But beneath that stability, something fractures. Because control does not resolve pressure. It seals it. And what is sealed does not dissolve. It waits for the next shift. A policy change, a transfer, a release date, or an unexpected loss. And when that moment arrives, the effects of control do not stay behind bars. They travel with the person. Time inside prison does not move forward. It circles. Days are measured by counts, not calendars. Weeks blur. Months lose texture. According to APA research on temporal perception in confinement, restricted environments distort the brain's ability to track time, increasing feelings of stagnation and emotional fatigue. For women, this distortion often intensifies psychological strain. Without meaningful markers, progress, choice, novelty, the mind shifts into maintenance mode. The goal is no longer growth or change. It is endurance. Craig Haney describes this phase as existential suspension, a state where identity pauses while the body continues. Plans feel abstract. The future feels theoretical. Behavior reflects the shift. Goals shrink. Risk-taking declines. Hope becomes conditional. The NIJ notes that long-term inmates often stop asking about timelines, programs, or outcomes, not because they don't care, but because anticipation becomes painful. John Owen observed that time inside prison teaches one primary lesson. Waiting is safer than wanting. The Chicago Crime Lab found that prolonged temporal distortion correlates with decision paralysis, difficulty initiating action even when options exist. A woman incarcerated in Louisiana explained it simply. "I didn't think about leaving. I thought about making it to tonight." This mindset is adaptive inside prison, but it carries consequences beyond it. When time is experienced as circular, preparation for the future becomes fragmented. Skills erode. Confidence thins. The ability to imagine change weakens. And yet, time continues to pass. Release dates approach silently. Transfers occur without ceremony. Life shifts while the individual remains still. This disconnect creates tension. Because eventually, time demands resolution. And when that demand comes, it does not arrive gently. After the gates. When the gates open, the system ends. But the conditioning does not. Research from the American Psychological Association shows that institutional adaptation does not reverse automatically. The behaviors learned for survival, silence, hypervigilance, emotional restraint, often persist long after release. Craig Haney warned that prison does not simply confine people. It reprograms responses. Women who leave incarceration carry invisible habits into the outside world. Difficulty making choices, discomfort with freedom, anxiety in unstructured spaces. What once kept them safe now isolates them. John Irwin described this as the final contradiction of imprisonment. The system demands adaptation, then punishes the adapted. The National Institute of Justice has documented that reentry outcomes are shaped not only by housing or employment, but by psychological residue, the lingering effects of control, time distortion, and learned powerlessness. These are not personal failures. They are predictable outcomes. The Chicago Crime Lab emphasizes that understanding incarceration as a behavior-shaping environment, rather than a moral one, is essential for reducing harm, improving reintegration, and preventing return. This documentary is not an argument. It is a record of how systems shape behavior, of how silence becomes strategy, of how survival leaves marks that cannot be seen. Because incarceration does not begin at the cell door. And it does not end at the gate. If you value fact-based, non-fiction documentaries that examine the psychology behind real systems, subscribe to this channel. Not for shock, not for spectacle, but for understanding.